Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Making alt text is really an art, not a science.
Mm.
But the question you need to ask yourself is, what is important that I get out of this image?
Mhm.
And to some people, all those details are important. In some situations, all those details are important.
Welcome to Biz Help for You, the show that saves you the expensive learning curve by providing advice from industry experts in every facet of the entrepreneurial journey. Too many small businesses collapse. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 20% fail within their first year, and less than 35% make it to their 10th anniversary. The goal of this podcast is to change that statistic. So if you're interested in learning more to be a successful entrepreneur, tune in today.
Thank you for tuning in to Biz Help for You with Candy Messer. Today I'm going to be talking with Angela Fowler on the topic of accessibility. By listening to today's episode, you will learn low-cost, high-impact adjustments you can make in your business to give you a competitive advantage when it comes to serving those with disabilities. So, Angela, welcome to the show.
Well, good early morning. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. I know this is an important topic. I have talked on accessibility a few times in the past over the last few years, but it's probably time to have that conversation again. So I'm glad that we are chatting. But before I get into the questions I have for you on the topic, I'd love just to ask you, what inspired you to start helping businesses focus on accessibility, and how has your personal experience shaped your approach?
Well, I want to be a part of the solution. I don't just want to be that person that calls and yells at customer service representatives, which does absolutely no good at all. All that does is just makes me feel good for 30 seconds until I feel guilty.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be a part of the solution. And the problem is that when businesses don't make their products accessible, it's not just customers with disabilities that have trouble. Most people have trouble. And businesses don't know. When was the last time you looked at your own website?
Mm-hmm. Right.
For me, it's been a while, right? You're too
Mhm.
busy running your business. So, not having looked at your own website, you might not know that there's basic usability problems, let alone accessibility problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, as a totally blind person, and I've been totally blind all my life, I spent a lot of time in the advocacy movement. And, the advocacy movement sort of becomes an echo chamber for our frustrations, right? So when we're trying to access a web page and it doesn't work, and we use screen readers. We can't see the screen, so we use a software program that actually tells us what's on the screen, literally reads it to us. But websites need to be built properly in order for that to work efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got form fields that aren't labeled, you don't know where your name goes.
Mm-hmm.
Controls that don't work with the keyboard,
Mm.
then that causes accessibility problems. And it used to just infuriate me, and it still frustrates me. The situation is frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
When you have visual assistance for something that should take all of 10 seconds, it's a frustrating situation. But most people aren't aware of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
When I took a job in 2021 working with designers and developers, I realized, most people want to do the right thing. They just don't know what the right thing is. In fact, as I alluded to, oftentimes they don't even realize there is a right thing.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I think too, as business owners, like I said, it's not like we're trying to cause any issues, and we really don't know what we don't know. We don't know how your software works.
Yep.
And what type of buttons we need to have, or like you said, labeling things. And then we're often dependent on others. Like, I'm not a website designer. Most of us as entrepreneurs aren't. So we're dependent on others to actually do the things that are necessary. So I would love for you maybe just to touch on, how can we actually begin evaluating our level of accessibility when we don't necessarily know what we don't know, and it can feel overwhelming trying to figure it all out?
Well, absolutely. And there's a couple of basic things that you can do. One is a simple keyboard test. Put your mouse away. You can have it back later, I promise. And put focus at the top of your website and just tab through everything. Can you tab to everything? Does the order in which you tab to everything make sense? Can you activate? Can you use enter to click through your navigation? So instead of clicking with the mouse, you hit enter.
Mhm.
Or do all those things work? Are your form fields labeled? So when you click on the label of a form field, you should be able to type at that point if it's an edit field. If you
Mhm.
can't, that means that the label's not associated with your form, and that means that the screen reader might not read it. Or if it's just icons and there's no label,
Mhm.
that might also be problematic. Now, there are special screen reader labels that people can use, but A, a lot of people don't know how to do that, and B, not all sighted people speak icon.
Mhm. Right.
So actual text labels are ideal.
Mhm. Right, I think that's where it just can become frustrating because we don't know all the things that need to be like I said, if we're talking about a website, there's other things that we could, probably be talking about as well in terms of accessibility, but I'm assuming websites are probably one of the key things that you are encountering that can become difficult to use and, maybe able to purchase a product or a service or however,
Mhm.
you need to get the things that you need. So, do you have any recommendations too on some of the things that we can use to identify where that is? I mean, I understand what you're saying, like, we could tap through and things too, but is there, like, a software even that will say on your website, this is something that needs improvement? Or, is it just really going through, like you said, and just trying to tab through everything or, use enter to go through?
Right. So if you want just a basic status report, you can download the AXE browser extension, the Axe checker. And there's a free version. Don't make it charge you for the paid version. There's a free version that basically just it tells you in developer speak what a lot of the issues are, but what it's going to do that's important to you is it's going to tell you how many critical issues there are, how many serious issues, how many moderate, and how many mild. And that's going to give you a general um idea of what you're up against. And when it comes to real life access, we take a harm reduction approach. If you don't have the budget to solve everything at once, we take a harm reduction approach and we say, okay, let's do two things. Let's solve the issues that are most impactful.
Mhm.
And let's also solve the simplest issues that give you the easiest wins.
Mhm.
Sometimes that involves just going into your form developer, editing each question, and actually adding a label. Sometimes people forget to do that because it's not part of what is the natural drag and drop workflow.
Mhm.
It should be, but these tools aren't necessarily designed with accessibility in mind. So you have to actually click on edit, go in and add your labels.
Mhm.
That's an easy win for you.
Right.
It's also very impactful.
Well, I was thinking as well about pictures because I have seen before too where you can add like text to a picture to describe, what that picture is. And I
Mhm.
don't necessarily know, like, can you tell us too, like, what are the words that would be most helpful to like describe it? Like, if you haven't seen before too, does saying like a color of something like help, or is it more like, two people shaking hands or like what? Like, help us know, like, what we should be putting as those words to help you understand what that image is.
Ask yourself, and what you're referring to is alt text.
Mhm.
If you hover over an image, you'll see the alt text. You can't see it otherwise. But it also serves as a placeholder if for some reason the image doesn't load. So it does benefit sighted people too. And making alt text is really an art, not a science.
Mm,
Um, but the question you need to ask yourself is, what is important that I get out of this image?
mhm,
And to some people, all those details are important. In some situations, all those details are important. But in most cases, if it's just two people shaking hands, you can identify the people if the people would be otherwise known. You're basically conveying the important information that a sighted person would see looking at the picture. I don't need to know that one's wearing a blue shirt and one's wearing a red shirt, unless you're advertising a clothing line or something.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about advertising, right? Maybe you want me to have that detail. Maybe you're advertising your own fashion line.
Mm.
So if you have a picture of somebody wearing, what your shirt, your whatever the thing is, you're gonna want to describe it because obviously you want me to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, maybe you want to identify the brand. Maybe you want, it depends. It depends on the situation. It depends on the context. It depends on what information you want me to get out of that picture
Mm-hmm.
in that situation at that given time.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Right. So if someone
Also,
does want to sell something and they want to be detailed about, like, this has stars on it and it's the dark blue, versus if it's someone like an attorney shaking hands with a client or something, so that where we would just determine how necessary those details are. Okay.
yeah, and the details, it's important to you. If you really need me to know that it's a dark blue, whatever, you
Mhm.
know.
Right.
Otherwise, the, what I like to say is be concise yet be descriptive.
Mhm. That makes sense.
So tell me what I need to know, nothing I don't, and be as concise as you can, which sounds hard, right?
Mhm.
And until you get used to it, it is hard.
Mhm.
But let me just say this: less than perfect alt text is a heck of a lot better than no alt text at all.
Mhm. Mhm. That makes sense. Well, I know we're talking more on, like, the visual side of things too, and I don't know if you, like, are familiar with maybe some of the struggles that others might have too that might help us understand accessibility that way too. So if someone is maybe hard of hearing, or if there's someone that has dyslexia or things like that too, like, do you have any guidance maybe on other issues besides blindness, or do you focus mainly just on teaching accessibility for those who are visually impaired?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you asked because as a blind person, I tend to lapse into the blind issues. Um, and I don't mean to do it to the exclusion of other issues, but sometimes on podcast interviews, I get what I call blindocentric.
Mhm.
Um, so you say dyslexia, there are dyslexia friendly fonts. But the important thing is not only for dyslexia, but for cognitive disabilities, you want to break your text up. So you want to use headings, lists, and images to really break your text up on the screen so you don't get one big blob of text.
Mhm.
Um, Funny story. I turned in a paper to my boss a couple months ago in my day job, and it was one of those things. Oh, we're just going to go over this at this meeting. It's not a final copy, no big deal. So I just wrote it up, and I said, "Yeah, I'll format it after the meeting." Right. So I didn't bother to put my headings in or anything like that. I give it to my boss, and she's like, "This isn't accessible to sighted people. You need to put some headings in here. I can't read this." So,
Well, you were able to share the basic content, but
I was a
like I said.
oh, I gave her what she asked for. I turned in the paper, but it wasn't
Okay.
it wasn't readable. So,
Mhm.
it just goes to show you, even for somebody who doesn't, necessarily have a disability,
Mhm.
making things user friendly, making things so that they don't have to make an effort um to read your content
Mhm.
is important. And it also shows you that everybody makes accessibility mistakes, right?
Right. Well, and I had heard that too. Like, if you're going to write a blog, maybe have 2 to 3 sentences max per paragraph. Maybe you could use bullet points to just like highlight some of the keywords without having everything written out in text because people may just skim over it or not read everything too. So, I have heard some of those kind of tips just in general. Like I said, not necessarily just talking about accessibility per se, but just making it easier to read overall.
Well, and accessibility is really just usability 2.0, right?
Right. Exactly. So, do you have
Mhm.
maybe a story you could share of someone that like you guided through this process that they were able to make a change and how it was able to impact their business and the customers maybe that they, were now able to serve much more easily?
So I had a client that I was working with her on her website, and she had the list of her most commonly used articles, and she had the links to her articles were image links,
Mm,
which didn't have alt text.
mhm,
So I guided her through. I showed her why it was a problem because I don't like, people understand if you show them.
mhm,
Um, so basically, the screen reader was just reading, gobbledygook. It wasn't reading. It was reading the URLs of the images,
mm,
which it should have been reading the titles of the articles.
mhm,
And so I guided her through that, and she's like, "Oh man, I didn't even realize that this, that this was going on." So she, made the necessary changes, and um, not only are blind people able to pick an article now and read it, but people who use, say, dictation software,
mhm,
we're talking about other issues. People who use like Dragon Naturally Speaking, right? Because they can't use their hands or whatever the thing is. They actually interact with the computer by telling the computer what to click on, literally.
mhm,
They talk to their computer. My computer talks to me,
mhm,
but we rely on the same labels.
mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. I knew someone in business who had a daughter who was in a wheelchair who had a headset, and she would turn her head,
Mhm.
and that would help her, like, through the websites, and that's how she was able to navigate too, so I was a little bit familiar, like, with that too, but I think there's just so
It's
much
called
we don't
yeah,
know.
it's called the switch device,
Mm,
and it uses the same mechanism as the keyboard does. So keyboard accessibility is also important to people who use switch devices.
mm. Yeah, I just think, again, we just don't know the things that we need to know to make this easier, for people to use. So I appreciate
Yep.
like you're even touching on all these different things to guide us as entrepreneurs. So how does that accessibility, when we're able to change like how we're doing it, how is that going to affect like our customer loyalty too and help our business reputation?
You're going to be the easy website to use. You're going to be oh, I'll order from these guys. They're super accessible. It's really easy. Um, you're going to be the one that when a blind person posts on Facebook and says, "I'm looking for an accessible fill in the blank," you're going to be the one they mention.
Mm,
Um, you're going to be the one they tell their friends about.
mhm,
And you're gonna see it in increased revenue, right? Because the cart abandonment is a big thing.
mhm,
If somebody's frustrated, um, especially if what you're selling isn't essential.
mhm,
If they're frustrated with the website, they'll just go somewhere else.
mhm. That makes sense. So, what about like things we can't control? Like, obviously, if we have our website, there's a developer who can pick, the right template or things like that too, and hopefully create everything that will be more accessible. But if we're using a social media platform or things like that too, where we don't necessarily have as much control over how things are shared on there? Like, what can we do to make it as accessible as possible if we're using, let's say, Facebook or LinkedIn or, whatever, software that is being used so that it's easier for you to see what we're trying to share?
Sure, and we understand social media platforms, but what you can do is you can make your posts accessible. Alt text, describe your memes. Make sure that you're not. When you write an essay, you're breaking up the essay a little bit so it's easier to read. Make sure your videos are captioned. Make sure your background music isn't drowning out your narration.
Mhm,
Um, So you can control how accessible the things you post are. You can't control the platform.
mhm.
And we know that.
So when you post an image on social media, it will still have like the alt text. So if I save it on my computer and I upload it, it will have it there? Or do I need to put a description within the actual post itself of what that image is?
Yeah, most social media platforms have a way of adding alt text. It usually involves right-clicking on the image, but then again, they change it every 5 minutes, so I'm not gonna.
Mhm. I think that's the hard part about keeping up with all of this is things
Yeah.
change so much too that even if we get something down where we think we know how to do it, now things have changed, whether it's again like someone updates like the website software and someone has updated social media or now the format of something has completely changed and we have to relearn all of that too. And so once again, we're trying to do all the things to run our company as well as do these things to market to everyone, and it just becomes overwhelming.
Well, and that's where real life access comes in. We can guide you through the important stuff.
Mhm.
We're your coach.
Perfect. So, are there like websites that people can go to that say, "Hey, I need help and I'm not sure how to improve these things," or what are like the checklists, that maybe I could follow, to do this? Is this something that you have? Is there something out there that we can use as a resource to guide us through this process?
Well, there's a number of checklists and things on the internet. I have, if you sign up for my newsletter, I have a top 10 things businesses can do. Um, Businesses can start doing right now to become accessible.
Mhm,
And it doesn't just talk about your website, right? It talks about your physical space. It talks about your
mhm,
your company culture.
mhm,
Um, But if you really want a more hands-on experience, um, and more one-on-one, personalized guidance, I'd recommend one of our coaching and consulting offers.
Okay, perfect. And you just touched on something too that I wasn't thinking about because now there's so many businesses that are like online only, but you touched on the physical location. So can you maybe give us a few tips too to make things more accessible if we have, let's say there's a restaurant or a store or something
Yep,
that you're going into?
and restaurants and stores are back in.
Mhm.
We are starting to go to them now.
Mhm.
Um, Jamming as much into your building as is humanly possible does not an accessible restaurant make.
Mhm.
Or store or anything else. I was at Burlington Coat Factory with my mom one time because she's the only one who can drag me to such a place. She's the only one with that power over me. And we're going through this aisle, right? And it's like I'm holding my hands maybe, I don't know, 14 inches apart.
Mhm.
Narrower than I am. And I'm going through this and I'm like, okay, this is claustrophobic, and I'm really shocked that I'm not leaving a trail of clothes in my wake. Clothes are
Mhm.
very resilient when it comes to that. And if I was using a wheelchair, this would be impossible.
Mhm.
I was glad to get out of there.
Mhm.
And to spread things out.
Mhm.
You don't need 30 tables in a space designed for 25.
Mhm.
That just slows everything down. It takes waitstaff longer, talking about restaurants. It takes waitstaff longer to get from place to place. Accidents are more common. People aren't as comfortable. People don't like to be sitting in the laps of strangers when they're trying to eat.
Mhm.
Um, just spread things out and, make sure there's no, people like their their potted plants and their decorations and things. Make sure said obstacles are not in front of important things like the restroom.
Mhm. Yep. That should be obvious, yes, but but probably isn't.
When it comes to accessibility, and it's like we discussed. Obvious has been canceled.
Right. Right. I mean, you would think that that would be clear, but again, we're not always thinking about that. A lot of times people are probably thinking like, I want to make it look nice, right? Not thinking about someone who's visually impaired might trip over something, and so we have to be really mindful of those
Or
things.
someone who uses a wheelchair, or
Mhm.
someone who is maybe uses a mobility cane.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, that's one thing I noticed. My son-in-law had been in a wheelchair for a while. He had had an accident, and
Mhm.
he couldn't even live in his home because the front and the back doors had steps, and he couldn't easily walk. So he had to actually stay in someone else's home for a while. So
Yep.
those are things you don't think of until it happens, right? And so it does bring to attention like what we really need to focus on, and even if he could have been in that gone up the steps, the house was so narrow, like I said, he wouldn't even been able to
Oh
fit the
yeah.
wheelchair through there too. So it's just things, like I said, until you come into a situation like that, where you either know someone who's in that situation or you personally are, it's often something we just don't think about. You just take for granted that you can see and hear and touch and, move around, walk, and all of those things. So I definitely appreciate.
I tell people we all look at life through the lens of our own experience
Mhm.
until and unless something comes along and broadens that lens.
Mhm. It's so true. Well, I know this is very informative. I do know you just mentioned that you had something if someone signed up for your newsletter, but I don't know if that was the offer you wanted to share. So I do want to ask you, do you have a specific offer, that you wanted to extend to our listeners? And if anyone wants to touch base with you, how can they-
Absolutely. So, go to my website, www.reallifeaccess.com. And yeah, you can sign up for my newsletter. You can also just book a free consultation with me. Just grab some time on my calendar. My calendar link is on the homepage. It's scattered other places throughout the website. I can't remember where because, yeah, when do we ever look at our own websites? But yeah, schedule that free consultation. Let's take a deep dive into your business and let's see what we can do.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Angela, for being a guest on my show. I really appreciate your sharing on this topic and, giving us just a little more insight into some of the things that we should be thinking of when it comes to how we can be more accessible for those who we want to be able to serve as our clients. So I appreciate your taking the time to chat.
Not a problem.
And to the listener, if you enjoyed today's topic and you want to hear additional information, you can find access to exclusive content in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in today. Would you please share this episode with those you know and leave a review on your favorite platform? And if you find our show informative, would you consider being a financial sponsor to help me continue my mission to educate business owners? A link is located in the episode description, and no amount is too small. I'd really appreciate your support. If you are interested in connecting with our guest and receiving the offer they had to share, a link to our resource page is in the show notes. Finally, if you have any bookkeeping or payroll needs, reach out to us at 310-534-5577 or contact@abandp.com. My team and I are eager to assist you. Until next time, have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Biz Help for You. Please join your host, Candy Messer, again next time. Have a terrific day.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.